So first of all, thank you so much for inviting me here. I always love talking to pilots about this story. I actually wrote the book for non-pilots, though. I wrote it to encourage young people to get into flying because I feel we have a shortage of pilots and not enough young people are getting into aviation. I'm doing my bit by bringing my son Ken here, and I'm giving him his private. He just soloed a couple weeks ago. Yay! So I'm going to start out by playing a 5-minute video that kind of tells my story and it also shows you some fun aerobatic flying, so you have some idea of the crazy sorts of things that I do. That was Channel 5 in the San Francisco Bay Area. So yeah, so they came out and did it. I thought they did a great job. So anyway, yeah, so any questions before we go on? I do want to say I'm hoping that this will be more of a conversation rather than just me talking. And I know some people expressed an interest in getting some tips about unusual attitude recovery, and I'm happy to answer questions on that. I have many years of instructing on unusual attitude recovery and basic aerobatics, and it's something I love doing, and so glad to talk about that as well, too. So I'm just going to I have some slides about my story. Does anybody want to, before I jump into it, any questions? Yes.
You do CFI work now?
I do.
Sort of limited?
On a very limited basis, yes.
Where are you based out
of? Payne.
Payne, oh, okay.
Yeah. But my full-time job, I'm a professor at the University of Washington, so that takes up most of my time. It's a pretty demanding job. And I teach students there. Yes?
What do you teach at UW?
I teach data visualization, which is taking very large amounts of data and applying a combination of computer science and art. So yeah. Yes?
You ever been to the Shade State Park?
No. Where is that?
You know where it is?
No.
Oh, it's due south of Lafayette through Crawfordsville on 47 down at the corner.
All right. So I did grow up in West Lafayette, but I did not know Purdue was known for flying. I didn't even fly. All right. So nobody in my family flew. And as a matter of fact, my parents thought flying, general aviation was dangerous. And I didn't even tell them when I started taking flying lessons. So that's kind of another story, I guess. So just to give a brief introduction to what I've done in aviation. So I've been a pilot since 1985, and then I jumped right in and started getting all my ratings and became a CFI in 1987. And then became an ATP. I have about 5,300 hours total time, of which 3,000 of that is tailwheel. 1,500 is aerobatics.
I have a question about
yes.
that. How do you log your aerobatics hours? Because I do that. Do you log actually when you're pulling G's or in?
No, it's takeoff to landing, right? Hey, I'm a pilot, right? You log time if, what is it? Somebody used to say if a jet flies by, 0.1 jet time, right? Yeah. No, it's But to be fair, most of the aerobatic flights are very short. And, we used to practice for the US Aerobatic team. We practiced in 15-minute slots. So you go up, and you're flying aerobatics right away, and that plane gets to altitude really fast.
Oh, really?
No kidding, yeah. And so it was pretty much all aerobatics, and then come in and land, right? So, but yeah. And I have about 2,500 hours of instruction given. I had every rating except seaplane and helicopter for a long time. And this summer, I finally got my seaplane rating. Yay! Kenmore, yes, exactly. I was on the US Aerobatic team twice from 1991 to 1994. And I was performing in air shows starting in 1990. Haven't done that for a while. I was just telling Ken that I actually flew air shows while he was in utero. I asked my doctor, I said, is it okay? And she said, yeah, it's fine. And I said, well, but wouldn't it be bad for the baby if I go upside down? And she said, the baby's already upside down. Yeah. I mean, they're cushioned in that amniotic fluid. It's actually pretty good. Maybe TMI, but still. She said it was perfectly safe, and Ken's here, and he's doing great. So
You needed more ballast, right?
there we go. Yeah, right. It's true. That made me a little closer to that 140 pounds. But all right. So then I got into aerobatic competition. I'll talk about how that is. I got really serious about aerobatic competition because I kind of fell in love with it, which was sort of surprising. And then I started a flight school, and I became a test pilot, and I just went into aviation, full time as my job.
What was a test pilot?
I was testing,
Aerobatic aircraft?
aerobatic aircraft, small aerobatic aircraft. I have like 2 hours of jet time. So, I am mostly a small plane, experimental aircraft pilot. But at the same time, I was working as a software developer in Silicon Valley. That's how I earned all my money for flying. And so I started out, I had a job that made me $24,000, huge amounts of money. And so I put it all into flying and none into clothes, as you can probably tell. I'm still doing that. And then I started, this small school. And at the same time, I went back and I worked at NASA as a computer scientist. And I also worked at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. So I've been working in, both dealing with very large amounts of data and computer science and data science for many years. And then for a while, I flew kind of full time, and then I sort of shifted back into flying more as a hobby. And today, it's really more of a hobby. I'm a professor at the University of Washington, and I love my work, but I still love flying. All right. I do want to start. So I always like to start with these embarrassing pictures of my childhood because it kind of shows how miserable I was as a kid and how I was the last person anybody would have thought would ever do anything daring. As a matter of fact, people thought of me as a very timid, quiet child, somebody who was never really going to accomplish much. I was incredibly, incredibly fearful. And my fears kind of ruled me. And so when I look back on it, I wonder what made me be such a fearful person. And I think part of it had to do with the fact that, so my parents are immigrants, so they both spoke with very thick accents. And as a result, my teachers would make these assumptions about me that, for example, that I couldn't speak English. And,
You're doing all right.
Yeah, it's my native language. I speak it better than anything else. But they always put me in the slow reading group every year. And I once wrote an essay that I was really proud of, but my teacher accused me of plagiarism. She said, someone like you couldn't possibly know all these advanced vocabulary words. And, and that's that kind of thing. She didn't mean to be cruel. She probably thought she was helping me. She probably thought, oh, we're going to tell this poor, disadvantaged Hispanic kid,
Copy things.
Yeah, right, that it's bad to copy, and I'm doing her a favor. But the fact is that kind of language had a corrosive effect on me. I mean, it affects kids. So those of you who work with kids today, don't assume that they can't do anything. They have limitless potential. And, no matter where somebody comes from, they deserve to be honored with that limitless potential. And this teacher she wasn't a bad person. She wasn't racist, but she was a cog in a wheel. And it's really a wheel that's still turning today unless we stop it. And this is why I wrote the book. This is why I talk, because I want to reach out to young people and to you adults and, and say this is what anybody can fly. Anybody can do this. I was absolutely the last person anyone would think would have a talent for flying. I had trouble learning to drive a car. I had trouble learning to ride a bike. okay? So, yeah. And I really want to give credit to one person in my life. So I didn't get a lot of encouragement from teachers, but my dad he always told me, he always said, Cecilia, you're brilliant. And I thought, he's my dad. He has to say that. But you know what? That also, lodged in me. And it helped give me the confidence to fight against all these other kind of negative feedback that I got. And it really only takes one voice, one supportive voice. And so this is why I became a professor, so that I can be that supportive voice for young people today. And I hope that all of you will think about this. If you have, a young relative or neighbor who maybe seems a little discouraged, go out to them and tell them that you believe in them, that you believe they can do anything. And I cannot say how important that is. Of course, we're going to talk about flying, and I think flying is a great way to build confidence for success in life in general. And so I really think everybody should learn to fly. Anyway, maybe some people don't agree. But my dad also so I was good at math as a kid. I was good at math and English, actually. But my dad encouraged me in math and said, keep doing this. And you know what? What ended up working great is if you get 100 on a math test and nobody else in your class does, the teacher can't accuse you of plagiarism. So math was a lot of fun for me, and I ended up, going into that field, continuing on. But you all came here to learn about how I got started in flying. So as I said, no background in flying. My father-in-law now was an Air Force pilot, but I didn't know him until afterwards, until after I started flying. So I grew up never even thinking about flying as a possibility, even though Purdue, of course, is a well-known aeronautical engineering school, and they have lots of airplanes there, but it just didn't occur to me. So I went to college in California, and I started working there. And while I was working in Silicon Valley, a colleague of mine said, hey, how would you like to go for a ride in a small airplane? And I still remember thinking, that's not the sort of thing that I do. I might die on this flight. So I almost said no, because that was my first reaction. But then I remember thinking, I have spent so much of my life being afraid and allowing my fears to limit my choices. Just this once, I'm going to fight against my fears. I'm going to push back, and I'm not going to do what seems to be the natural thing. I'm going to do something different, because it sounds like so much fun. So I went up with him. And it turned out that I loved it. He let me handle the controls. We flew out over the San Francisco Bay. It was the most gorgeous experience you can possibly imagine. And after that one flight, I said, okay. I got down on the ground and I signed up for flying lessons. But I have to say I was a terrible student. Because, of course, the fear didn't go away. And so every time I drove up to the airfield, I would see the airplanes coming in for a landing, and I would think, maybe my instructor will be sick today. Maybe the airplane will have a mechanical problem and I can get out of my lesson. But I kept on with it because the joy of flying was greater than the fear. And so I just kept pushing through, and what I discovered is, first of all, that fear, if you start thinking about what is rational, I have a rational mind. I'm pretty logical. I'm a mathematician, after all. And so I realized, if you apply logic to flying, there's a lot of ways you can improve the odds in your favor. There's certain things. I'm never going to break the 8 hours throttle to throttle rule, for example. Instantly, boom, your chance of a fatality goes up by 50%, because 30% of aircraft fatalities, alcohol is involved. So that's a simple one. And the other thing is that any time you do something over and over again, you get better. I will say that now I am totally not afraid of getting into an airplane and flying. I'm probably more afraid of standing in front of a group of people who I don't know and giving a talk. So you can accustom yourself to amazing things if you just do it step by step by step. All right, and of course, using math in flying is always there is math in flying, and so math is really useful too. This is something else I always like to tell people: learn math and learn flying. It's pretty cool. All right, so then I was a CFI, but I started getting worried. What happens if a student puts me into an accidental spin? What am I going to do? And I started getting more scared as I flew with my students. And I said, well, you know what? I need to take an aerobatic course and really learn how to handle the aircraft in unusual attitudes, just like I learned how to drive in the snow and handle a car in a skid back in Indiana. So I said, okay, it's a 10-hour course. I will do this for 10 hours, and then I'll never do it again. But it turns out aerobatics is kind of dangerous because you might end up liking it. And it was very dangerous for my pocketbook. I just went through it. I started flying competition, and it became a passion. I was obsessed with flying, and I just continued doing it. I will say I had a lot of challenges to overcome. Like I talked about, so I tell kids about this too, right? That the flying was scary. I had trouble with nausea. I was the sort of person who got sick in a car. I actually threw up in a car, and I threw up on a Ferris wheel, just to show you how bad I was about how weak my stomach was. But you know what? All of these things can be overcome. If you fly every day, you build up your tolerance, and you end up being able to overcome air sickness. It's nobody. I will say that everybody I fly with now, I mean, I've flown with hundreds of students teaching them aerobatics. Everybody has some limit. Nobody will never get sick in aerobatics. I mean, I had one guy challenge me once, and I got him. But I will say that all the people I train, not one of them has ever actually thrown up in my airplane. This is very important. You can see when people start getting a little bit off, right? And we come in and land, and then they're still excited to come back and do it again. You don't want to take somebody to the point where they throw up, because then they'll never, ever want to go flying again, and you have to clean up the plane. So it's two bad things. But anyway, the other problem I had is, as you heard in the video, is that I'm really, US airplanes are not designed for, I'm 5'2" and I weigh 100 pounds. And so these planes aren't designed for someone like me. It's a problem. It's a real problem. And I'll tell you later on a story about how a factory should deal with these questions. But I did call up the Pitts factory and said, this is a problem. Your plane is designed for somebody who's 5'10", and the minimum weight is 140 pounds. I mean, I know a lot of people who are less than 140 pounds. Have you considered doing something different to maybe expand your market to all the women in the country? And they said they weren't interested. So
There's a problem in the other direction as well.
Yeah, if you're too tall, you also can't fit in it. Exactly. So, so how do you do it? There's actually ways to design a cockpit so it can fit a wider range. And, don't want to say anything nice about the Russians these days, but I have to say they designed their aerobatic Sukhoi so that because they had an airplane that the whole team had to use, and they had small women pilots my size, and they had big guys. and they all had to use the same plane because it wasn't like here where we all owned our planes. There, they had a team plane. And they have adjustable rudder pedals. And with the adjustable rudder pedals, you can get a really wide range. You know, so it's a technically solved problem. Anyway, I figured out my own way, which was I got these special shoes made. Flying for me, not only was it fun and I loved it, but it also gave me courage to do all sorts of other things in my life. I dropped out of school at one point before I learned to fly because a professor at UC Berkeley told me, women don't have the intellectual capacity for computer science. You know, and I didn't believe him, but it kind of made me feel bad. And then whenever I had trouble, the thing is those little voices start popping up in my head. Could that possibly be true? You know, luckily my dad set him straight in my own mind, right?
Well, men don't have the capacity for social sciences.
Well, no, that's not true. That's not true either. Yeah. The point is that anybody has a capacity for anything, really. You know, and it's not a good idea to tell women, "Oh, you don't like computer science because there's not enough people in it." That's BS. I mean, there's lots of people in computer science. As a matter of fact, data science is all about the human. So anybody can accomplish anything they want. And it's really, really important that we don't allow these stereotypes to limit us. And after I made the US Aerobatic team, I had faced death, really. I mean, because I pointed my airplane straight at the ground at 250 miles an hour and then waited. I mean, that's not something I would ever have done as a kid when I was, you know, when I thought climbing on a ladder might risk, you know, I might fall off and break my spine. But I will say that probably the proudest moment of my life was when I stood on that podium at the World Aerobatic Championships, which is like the Olympics of aviation. And they were playing the national anthem because I'd won a medal. And my parents, my immigrant parents, were in the audience seeing their daughter represent their adopted country. And they were so proud, and tears were coming down.
Nice.
And yeah, that.
Where did your parents immigrate from?
So my dad is from South America, and my mom from the Philippines.
Nice.
All right, so they're adult immigrants to the U.S. And they actually met at UC Berkeley, you know, where they came to study. And then my dad moved to Indiana to be a professor at Purdue in physics. So
The competition over in Europe somewhere?
yes, it usually is in Europe. This one was in Hungary. So yeah.
How did you get your airplane there?
Yeah, well, nowadays they have to get the wings off and put it in a container and ship it over. But back in those days, things were a little easier. The C-5As, the big cargo jets, would fly empty back from so they would take their load somewhere and then they would fly back empty. And so what the government used to do to make a little money is they would rent the empty flight back to people, you know, just limited selected groups, right? And so we rented the C-5A for $150,000, which was probably pretty cheap even back then, but it was coming back empty anyway. And then they rolled all our airplanes into it. There's actually there's a PBS Nova special called Daredevils of the Sky, and if you find it, they show how they loaded our airplanes, and they put them on dollies and rolled them in sideways. Yes, exactly, with the wings nose to tail. Yeah, and they fit all our airplanes in there.
How many airplanes on there?
There were 10.
Really?
Yeah, 10 team members, right? And yeah. So that was, and you know, we had to fly space available, so we were sleeping in the hangar, you know, and then they said, okay, 3 a.m., there's the plane, go. But hey, we would do anything to get our airplanes over there. It's a lot easier than containering it.
So the Air Force isn't doing that anymore?
No. I don't know whether it's 9/11. I mean, it's probably sort of a security nightmare if you think about it. But now we just container them. So, yeah. All right, and so the point, too, that I want to make, which is why this is why I like to talk to people about it, is even if you're not going to get really nutso about aerobatic competition and flying, it's a wonderful hobby, and it does wonders for your confidence. After I did what I did in flying, I felt that I could accomplish anything in my life. And so I was able to go back and finish my PhD, which I thought was kind of an unbelievable mountain. Oh, only smart people get PhDs, and I'm not smart. You know, why did I believe that, right? I mean, if you hear a young person saying, well, I'm not good at that, I don't like that, that's not for me, really probe them a bit to see, is it because they had a teacher who discouraged them? Or is this something they really might want to try to do? Maybe they just learned that if something was hard, it wasn't right for them. They want to do something easy. You know, doing hard stuff is so much fun. That's what we have to do. You have to do things that are a challenge because your life gets better later on. And there's so many reasons why. All right, so I went on and became a professor at the university, and I have to say it's really, aside from flying, it's my dream job. I mean, it's really, I love teaching students. I love talking to all the young people. They kind of keep me young, you know. They tell me all the stupid things, the okay boomer stuff that I'm doing wrong, you know. And it's good. It's good for me. It's more growth, right? So I just want to say that, again, as a child, I didn't even know how to speak in front of a group of people. I used to go for days in school without even opening my mouth because I was afraid to talk. And now, it's not a problem. I mean, I've talked in front of really large groups, and I enjoy it. So think about somebody in your life who maybe needs a little bit of challenge or excitement or needs some motivation to really achieve. And I think telling them they can do anything and then maybe giving them a little help with flying can accomplish that. So thank you so much for having me. I'm going to throw this open for questions. Yes?
Tell us about your book.
Okay. So one thing I'm not good at is self-promotion and sales. Yeah. But I will say that my publisher tells me whenever I give a talk, I should bring a few copies of the book. And I say, nobody will want it, you know. And I also, yeah, right. Well, you know what? Okay, that's true. I did get a 2-star review on Amazon from someone who said, this book has too much flying. So, yeah. So I'm going to ask, so Ken, could you bring my flight bag up here? It has some materials that I brought. So I have I brought a couple copies of my book. If people are interested, I can sign it for you if you want. Or it's probably cheaper if you can go and buy it on Amazon. And then I have a newsletter where I tell little stories about my life, and some of it's about flying, some isn't. And you can always unsubscribe. So if you want to be on there and see what sorts of things I'm doing. And I do have cards. They have pictures of my airplane on the back if anybody wants that.
Do you have the Sabre?
I do not.
So what was that plane?
The Sabre?
Yeah.
It was one of
extra.
It's sheet design or
it was modified. Okay, it was based on an extra 230. It was actually built. I built it, right, or I had it built. It was based on an extra 230, but it was beefed up to have a 260 horsepower engine, a Lycoming AEIO 540, that was souped up, you know. Sure. And And it was, there's a great story about, okay, I'll tell this little story. It's in the book too.
There I was.
But yeah, there I was, right. So I had just made the US Aerobatic team in a stock Pitts S1T. All right, and back then, and even now, that plane was underpowered for the top category. Mm-hmm. And so there were sequences that we were supposed to fly that I could not fly in my airplane. I actually had to kind of compromise and sort of adjust it to be able to fly it. But I made the team, and I was so proud of doing it when everybody said it was not possible. And I was the only person to do that. And then, so there I was, being really proud and happy and having my nice big ego. And one of the former team coaches walks up to me and sort of looks at my airplane and says, "Oh, is that a stock, Pitts?" And I said, "Yes, completely stock," because I thought he was going to say, "Good job." And he sort of folds his arms and says, "You know, that plane is obsolete in the world competition." And I said, "Oh?" He said, "You need to get a monoplane." And I said, this Pitts cost $40,000, and it was all I could do to afford to buy it. A monoplane costs $150,000. Even the used ones, the better ones, cost $200,000. I said, no way am I going to be able to afford to buy a $150,000 or $200,000 airplane. He said, "Oh, well, in that case, maybe we're not going to why should the U.S. spend the money taking you over to the contest if you are not competitive?" I thought. So I went home really dejected after having done all this to be told, "Oh, because you're too poor, you can't fly in the World Championships." So I started thinking, well, maybe somebody has a used monoplane that I could buy. Back then, everybody was going from the 4-cylinder monoplanes to the 6-cylinder ones. That was the time in the late 80s. And but no, nobody was selling those used 4-seat planes for less than $150,000. I mean, it was just beyond what I could do. I mean, even working my 2 jobs. So then somebody said, "Oh, well, there is this really well-known aircraft builder, Alan Gehringer, who is in Selma, California, and there is a project that he was working on, but the guy who was working on it lost interest. And so maybe he'll sell it to you for cheap." So, okay, so I went over and talked to them, and sure enough, the guy was willing to sell it. And Alan said he could finish it, and I said, "How much will all this cost? You know, if I buy the plane for $25,000, you know, how much would Alan charge me to finish it?" And so he sort of hemmed and hawed and said, "I could probably do it for about $50,000. So I thought, okay, $75,000. That's still a lot, but you know, maybe if I live on nothing but beans and rice and maybe get a 3rd job, I can probably afford that." And of course, I wanted to fly, you know, so it's like I'm going to do what it takes. So I bought the project and that's how I got the Sabre. But there was still a problem, because once I started, and Alan, the builder, warned me about it. He said, "You know, this is an untested airplane. We don't know whether it flies well. You know, it has a good solid wing, and I'm sure it's going to be safe, but will it have the handling characteristics that you really want? Maybe not." So I got on the plane, and sure enough, it did not have the handling characteristics I wanted. I was flying it, and I did a snap roll, and they said, "That looks like a decathlon snap."
Ow.
Yeah, that's not, if you can't fly that plane better than that, we're not going to take you to the World Championships. So I said, "Oh, no, not again." So I said, "What can I do?" So I tried to call a lot of people to ask for help, and nobody had any answers until somebody said, "Why don't you call Leo Laudenslager?"
Yeah.
Does anybody know who he is? Yeah. 7-time national champion, one of the best pilots in the world. I said, "Me? Call him? Why would he even give me the time of day?" But I was desperate, so I called him. And he said, "Oh, okay. I'm going to be in Guthrie, Oklahoma on Thursday. If you get your airplane there, I'll fly it, and I'll give you an analysis of what I think is wrong with that. Wow, what an amazing thing to do for somebody you don't know. And
California this time?
I was in California. I had a job. You know, I had 2 jobs. So I had to get time off, and I had to fly out there, you know, in a couple days. But
You did tell you were on the team and won the competition.
I did say that, yeah. But yeah, that might have helped a little bit. But yeah, and anyway, I mean, he was a super nice guy. He didn't. I mean, this is his time that he gave me. He didn't have to give me his time. So I got out there, and he flies the plane, and then he says,
Needs more rudder.
he says, well, it's got problems. And so he ends up telling me, yeah, you need a new rudder, you need new elevators, you need new ailerons, you need a new wing. And I said, well, you mean you want me to just take the airplane apart and leave what's the plate, the
Data plate.
the tail, what's that thing called?
Data plate.
Data plate, yeah, leave the data plate on there and everything. And he said, well, I said, I don't have any money, I'll put it onto this. And he sort of said, well, the people here, Zivco Aeronautics, are probably the best aerobatic builders in the world. Why don't you talk to them and see whether they can do it? And I said, yeah, but even if I could somehow afford this, I have to be at the team training in 6 weeks. I have to have an airplane that flies and be able to fly it, or they're not going to take me to Europe. And so I went and talked to Bill Zivco, and he sort of looked at the plane and thought about it and said, I think we could do this in maybe 5 weeks. So I thought, okay, and then he offered to give me a partial sponsorship, which was amazing. And then I went home, and I have to say, one of the other things I learned to do was I learned how to become a fundraiser. I didn't have my own money, so I had to raise money to be able to be on the team. And I actually was lucky because I had a friend who was one of the top fundraising consultants in the country, and she taught me how to do it. And that also is really useful because now that I'm at the university, I have to do a lot of fundraising. I mean, that's a big part of my job, getting grants. And I'm really good at it now. So what you learn matters in every possible way. So who would have thought that flying aerobatics would help me be a more successful professor, but it did. So anyway, so I raised the money, and long story short, I got out there. Bill Zivco delivered right on time. I spent a week just flying, and I got just barely good enough to get to the team practice, and they pronounced me okay. And I went and flew in the World Championships, and as a rookie, I placed 4th. Right, I was the second best in my team. So, anyway, okay. So you asked for the story. You got maybe a longer one than you wanted. Doesn't somebody want to ask about unusual attitudes or aerobatic maneuvers?
Yeah. Okay, so you're flying, or maybe landing behind this jet.
Ah, yes.
Heavy that just took off.
Yes.
You get into an uncontrolled inversion. I've never done it. I don't want to do it, but what do you do?
Okay. Yeah. So I have to say the only people who have survived being flipped inverted by wake turbulence that I know of are aerobatic pilots. So that is probably the single safety benefit of being an aerobatic pilot. I teach a recovery from inverted class in the Super Decathlon, and I will say that I tell everybody the last thing you want to do when you roll invert, you think you're just going to continue the roll, and that's fine, but what is the mistake you're going to make? when you get inverted, you're going to pull back on the stick. You're going to pull back on the stick, and what does that do? Oh, let me show you. I brought something. So since I brought my flight bag, I brought what a aerobatic instructor should never be without. When you roll inverted, the nose is going to drop, and you are going to pull back on the stick because it seems to be a human instinct, because I tell all my students, don't pull back on the stick, and they all do it the first time. What you need to do is push forward. You need to look out at the horizon and keep the nose above the horizon. And just keep rolling.
Right.
All right, so push forward on the stick or yoke and keep rolling. Now, the good news is that it really doesn't take that much to learn. This is a 3-hour course that I taught, and at the end of it, everybody would keep rolling. In the decathlon at least, and would come around and could recover without losing any altitude. That said, if you're out in a Cessna or a plane that's not aerobatic, when you push this, what's going to happen?
The engine's going to quit.
Exactly. And so, but you know what? Airplanes can still roll, and they can still fly inverted. I mean, it's just an inverted glider, and you just keep going, and you can recover and get it back upright, and the engine will start right up. All right? So that's the most important thing, is keep the nose up and keep rolling.
If you get to inverted, keep going.
Keep going, yeah. Of course, so generally speaking, all right, if you are in an unusual attitude, if you are, if you're 90 degrees or even a little past it, if you're about 100 degrees, roll back. Mm-hmm. All right, because it's much better to do that than it is to go through the 270 around the other way. It might even be more like 120, roll back. All right, unless you're still if you're still rolling and you can't go against it, if it's a big enough wingtip vortex, then you may have no choice. You may have to just keep going. But once you get to about this, and it'll probably be down here, just keep going. Right, and then roll upright and get it back. And it's not likely. I mean, I'm sure all of us have gotten caution wake turbulence, and none of us here have been rolled inverted. But it's something you do have to watch out for. And I will say, as a PITS instructor, even just teaching landings, this never happened to me, but a good friend of mine was teaching landings in a PITS, and the student thought they were on the ground, and so they were pulling the stick all the way back. Boom, they did a half snap roll to inverted. And the one thing they did right is they threw their hands up in the air and said, "Your airplane!" And my friend said, yeah, and so he was full throttle and pushing forward on the stick, and it was on the edge of a stall, right, inverted, and he said luckily there was kind of a ditch off to one side of the runway, so he sort of eased off there and got flying speed again, and then climbed out inverted, and then rolled upright. So it's a useful skill to know how to fly upside down.
Seatbelt up.
Yes, you always want to make sure your seatbelts are really tight, and in an aerobatic airplane you want to have two. I broke a seatbelt once. Yeah, I was pushing hard in my pits, 8 negative G's or something, and the seatbelt broke. But I had another one, so it was okay.
What broke?
What broke? This is probably my fault, because I had it was an experimental aircraft, and I had kind of used like a DIY seatbelt where I had a ratchet sewed on there with 2 halves of it, and the ratchet was holding it together. And even though the person who did it, it was a certified seatbelt, what do you call it? It was a sewing machine designed for seatbelts, but it wasn't designed for going upside down at 8 G's, right? And so the webbing, the the threads, the stitching broke. Yeah, and so the seatbelt came apart. Yeah. So yeah, so after that I said, okay, that was a lesson for me. You know, whenever I put a ratchet on, I make sure if the ratchet fails, that there's a backup with the belt itself.
What maneuver were you in at the time?
It was a push up to an inverted hammerhead, right? So just a hard, you know, so I was coming in really fast and then pushed really hard. So it was probably the highest G maneuver in my sequence.
There's several kit manufacturers that only provide a 3-point restraint.
Really? Okay. 3-point restraint?
One here, like a car.
Oh yeah, no, you need a 5-point aerobatic harness. If you're going to do aerobatics. A 3-point harness is great for straight and level flying, but it's kind of unusual. A lot of people, even mechanics, don't really understand what it means to an aerobatic airplane to be stressed to 6 Gs and to be turned inverted. So I had a mechanic once tell me, you know, oh, I know everything about an airframe, and you know, and then I said, well, what about the brake system? And he said, it's the same brake system. And I said, well, what happens if you go upside down? A lot of brake systems have a vent, and then the hydraulic fluid will go all over your cockpit if it's not a sealed one, which you need for an aerobatic airplane. So, and the other thing too is when you're pulling that many Gs, all the little pieces and the metal tubes and the fuel lines, they shift. I mean, your airplane really shifts a lot under aerobatics, tremendous amount. And you know, like lines that are this far apart might touch and start chafing. That actually happened to me in my pits. I got in the plane one day and I smelled more fuel than usual. So I thought, huh. And I looked and everything seemed fine. There was no leaks. But I thought, you know, this doesn't seem right. Why would I smell more fuel than usual? So I took it over to my mechanic, and he looked at it and he said, oh, and he showed me in the fuel pressure line, it had been chafed so that there was a paper-thin piece of aluminum holding that fuel in. He said that on your next flight, that would have come loose. You would have had a high-pressure line all over the cockpit, probably an engine fire. You know, if it leaked or possibly. So yeah, so I learned to be, if something feels a little wrong, it sounds a little wrong, it smells a little wrong, I will not fly the plane until I check it. And that's why I'm still alive after 5,300 hours.
It's not going to get better with aerobatic flight.
No, it will not. And it will definitely get worse. I mean, I can tell you, I was just telling Ken that, you know, on my pits I broke a flying wire once. I mean, there's all these things that break on aerobatic airplanes, and you think they're not going to, but then they do. And yeah, so great questions. More? Or are you tired of listening to me?
Since
What's our time? I'm sorry?
The other competitors, were they in the same financial situation? Are they all?
No, they were all pretty well-to-do. It was only me. A lot of them were really independently wealthy. And then there were a few that were, you know, the poor ones were airline pilots, and they were, you know, and they were making
They're just cheap. Yeah.
Yeah, they were just, well, they were making salaries that were 3 or 4 times mine. So, you know, in those days, computer programmers didn't make as much as they do now.
So, can you tell us briefly about your STEM programs you have?
Yes. So one of my passions is reaching out to kids and trying to encourage them to get into STEM fields, because I think a lot of people are discouraged because they think it's hard, and I want to tell them, no, you know, it's hard, but that doesn't mean you should stop doing it. You know, if you keep doing it bit by bit, you will learn all those pieces. You know, it's just like learning to fly an airplane, right? You don't jump in and start doing aerobatics on day one. You learn how to start the engine, you know, and you start with the basics. And it's the same way with math and science. You need to start with the basics and then build up. And so I do all these programs. I'm happy to talk to groups of young kids, and I talk to people. I've talked to preschoolers. I can do programs for preschoolers. You know, it's all about fun and flying. I can, and all the way up to, you know, high school students and middle school students, and I really enjoy doing that.
So is it just a series of talks, or do you actually have a little institute, or what?
I just do talks.
Okay.
I mean, that's really
Okay.
that's what I prefer to do. I mean, I can come up with, I have in the past come up with little workshops, but that's a lot of work. And since I volunteer for most of these things, you know, I want to, and I'm busy because I have my job and I have to teach my son to fly, and I have, you know.
How's he doing?
He's doing great, really. Except he's got to land on the center line.
The center line's a little overrated.
That's right. The center line is always, and yeah. But he's doing a good job. He gets the, you know, he does full stall landings even in the Cessna. I'm like, yes, yes, right. So yeah. So thank you, and thanks for having me.